Welcome to the NZXT H1 custom loop, and probably my most difficult water cooling project to date. Now, I've done a couple of videos on the NZXT H1 before. I've done a case review and a how to build guide, but this one here is for those enthusiasts who want to push things a little bit further. More importantly, if you want a much quieter gaming experience from the H1, this is definitely a solid option since we're water cooling the GPU. So let's quickly talk about some of the parts that went into this build and then some of the challenges that I faced building this. So for the CPU, I went with AMD's 16-core Ryzen 3950X. Intel's upcoming 10th gen i7 or i9 CPUs could also be a good option if you want to focus purely on gaming performance, but let's say hypothetically this rig will also do a bit of number crunching or encoding on the side. The 3950X is plugged into the ASUS ROG Strix X570i motherboard, which I've found to be the most stacked X570 ITX board available, and I'm also using 16GB of 3200MHz memory along with a single M.2 NVMe drive. GPU choice is definitely something that needs a bit of consideration though. An RTX 2080 Ti would not be the most sensible choice for this build since we are fairly limited with Radiator space. Having said that, the Radiator is mounted in a fairly decent location and gets a good amount of airflow. So I went with an RTX 2070 Super, which I think will be an excellent choice. That way you're still getting some really solid gaming performance. You can also stream on this GPU as well via NVENC, all while not pushing too much heat into the loop. Also, the water block that I've got on there is EK's Quantum Vector RGB. When it comes to the water cooling hardware, the approach here was to make the entire loop as minimal and simple as possible. For starters, instead of using a discrete D5 pump, which there honestly isn't any room for, I've used AlphaCool's IceBear LT Solo CPU pump block. This is powerful enough to run the entire loop. I've tested this against both DDC and D5 pumps in a single radiator loop, and I found zero difference in thermal performance. It's also powered by a single 3-pin header, which makes cable management one less thing to worry about. Now for the radiator, I've used EK's 140mm Coolstream SE rad, which should give us slightly more performance compared to the standard AIO that comes fitted with the NZXT H1. For the fittings, I've gone with AlphaCool's 90-degree compression fittings, and I've paired those with EK's ZMT matte black tubing. Also note that to add an additional fill and drain port to the loop, since we're not using a dedicated reservoir, I've added a 3-way terminal block to the GPU and a fill port connected directly to that pump block. Now, by far the biggest challenge that I had with this build was trying to figure out where to route the tubes from the radiator, because if you have a look at the default pre-installed 140mm AIO that's in the H1, you've got the tubes coming out from the top of the radiator, but every aftermarket rad on the market has them coming out of the front. This leads me to easily my favorite part of this build, the double jointed 90-degree radiator fittings that allow you to open and close the radiator hinge effortlessly without any tubing getting jammed. In a weird way, it's one of those oddly satisfying things to watch over and over, and I don't think this could have turned out any better. Routing the tubes from the CPU pump block was also quite the challenge, and again, I've used double 90-degree fittings here for each of the ports. The tubing from the GPU is fed through a fairly small gap between the power supply and the frame. It's just enough to fit both of them, and that keeps it nicely in place. So yes, all of the panels do go on nicely without any resistance, and that tempered glass front panel has never been any more welcome. There's no need for any additional RGB LED strips, as we get plenty from that EK water block and just behind the motherboard. If you are interested in the thermal performance of this build, do stay tuned for part 2, where we will be taking quite in-depth look at the 140mm radiator and if that is enough for a 2070 Super and a 3950X in the NZXT H1. All of the parts will be listed down below. As always, a huge thanks for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.